My name's Paul Northcott. I am an independent safeguarding consultant, and as part of that remit, I undertake case reviews around cases such as dealing with those children involved with toxic stress. Involvement in the programme up to date has just been in the early stages, obviously looking at how ACEs affect toxic stress and linking together with TLI in respect to taking the programme forward. So prevalence in respect of toxic stress, I think that's I've got a real interest in that. So as part of my work to do with reviews, I've worked together with a number of obviously a number of agencies undertaking reviews in respect of child practice reviews as well, and also talked to victims. And it's been really interesting listening to their journey through the systems, so through social care, through perhaps placement out of areas, impact and the impact that adverse childhood experiences have had on their lives. And you often don't get that insight. And but when you actually talk to them, you can see all their exposure to neglect, traumatic family upbringings, domestic abuse, mental health, substance abuse within their family settings, and how that has impacted on their life and their behaviour. And I think that's the real important one for me, and that's why I find the questions as part of this toxic stress input really interesting. So these children, and then you can see that along that journey as they get older, that manifests itself into all sorts of behavioural issues. They're seen as complex behavioural issues, and offers on occasions dysregulated behaviour, which then has an impact on the way that professionals deal with them. So sometimes they're seen as children and young people who have got problems that are difficult to address, that they're failing to engage with services, and yet you can see where they come from. So why would they? They've lost their confidence. There's been a real lack of support around their strengths, and as a result of which, they exhibit these behaviours, which, like I said, a number of agencies say that it's difficult to deal with. So safeguarding processes are clearly set out for all agencies, and they're set out at sort of local, regional, and national levels. National levels within working together to safeguard children, the policy document and practice document. And those safeguarding processes, agencies should adhere to them. And what would generally happen is if a child or a family come to the notice of agencies, particularly children's social care, then obviously a referral is made into children's social care, and that's reviewed from a multi-agency perspective at what they call a multi-agency safeguarding hub, and all that information is collated and put together to make an assessment in very simplistic terms, to make an assessment about the next step forward and what work should take place together with that child and their family. Often there's initial what was originally termed as early help, so perhaps universal, what they term as universal services. So there's a specific threshold which they adhere to, and what they'll do is look at that child's case, and then what they'll do is look at where that child's case sits on the threshold, and that sits everything from like I said, universal services. So one agency, perhaps education, invariably doing a lot more work on an individual basis with that child and their family. And then it goes through a variety of different stages, right up to across the continuum, right into full intervention, where the child gets taken into care. During that process, a number of different structures and meetings which take place. So you might have strategy meetings, or what they call case conference meetings, about the child and the families. Each local authority might, whilst there's national guidance in respect of that, they might have a slightly different approach, but invariably the basics are the same. And then what they would do is what they should do is consider that child together with the family and look at almost what's going on in that child's life and what intervention should and could take place within the existing resource base that they've got. Often my experience is that whilst a lot of agencies are starting to recognise the importance of adverse childhood experiences, what happens is that whilst they might be recognised at the start of the case and part of the family's history, they're not really considered perhaps as much as they should be as the child goes through the rest of the process. Particularly when the children get into adolescence, then then agencies tend to deal with what's in front of them as opposed to looking back into the past and thinking the child is acting in this way because of the fact that this is everything that's happened in their previous life. And the problems that you see, and it was part, some of the questions that were previously asked, was what you'll see is that agencies tend to deal with individuals perhaps in a very siloed manner. So they'll deal with them from their agency's perspective. And whilst there might be multi-agency meetings, there are all sorts of issues with regards to them being effective. And as a result of which, there's nobody with that holistic overview of the family and the child or young person. And so as a result of which, perhaps they don't look back into the past and link in the adverse childhood experiences, and that's why the child is suffering from toxic stress. And then going forward, when the child goes through what they call transition, so they go from the age of 16 perhaps to 18, and 18 they become the adult, and then they move into, even if they're still having care and support, then they move into the adult world, and as a result of which, often again, nobody's looking back at perhaps their past history as much as they should be. And certainly from a lot of agencies' perspective, trauma-informed practice and a strength-based approach is not something that's perhaps prevalent inside of agencies as much as it should be. What I find, and again, it's evidenced by the reviews that I've been part of, and certainly the ones that I've read as well, is that what you'll tend to find is that you get really good individuals working within agencies. So you've got certainly there's some really good practice perhaps within education. Social workers, specific social workers working within children's social care, health. Health, specific health workers, have really good interaction perhaps with the family and with the children. But what happens is just not joined together effectively. And as a result of which, agencies talk a lot about the child's voice and listening to the child and a whole systems approach. But I've found that there has been improvements in practice around listening to children and the family. So at some of the formal meetings, such as case conferences and some of the planning that goes on, you'll certainly get the child's voice recorded. But are the agencies and all the people who are actually involved in that, are they listening to what the children are saying? And are they listening to what the family are saying? And then as a result of which, are they making the best use of the resources that are currently available to them? So what you'll often find is there is agencies will turn up at these formal meetings. There's a formal plan put into place, and often that plan is just taken from meeting to meeting without somebody really having an in-depth look at that and making sure it's dynamic in addressing the risks within that child's life, going forward. And then there's also the added challenge of risks within that child's life and ineffective risk assessments, and somebody having that overview about pulling all of that together. And there are certain key people within the child protection system which should be doing that. That's their responsibility, but often because of issues in the system such as time pressure, workload, finance, that's got a blocker to effectively delivering services which the children and their families need. And outside of that, you've also got all the added pressure as well that then perhaps there's a lack of services to support that family in the first place and to signpost them to. So if an agency needs additional support around therapeutic services, psychological services for health assessments, those types of issues, then and again, who do they go to? And sometimes again, there's not the funding, even when the service is in place, there might not be the funding available for it. So again, it's that inability to draw all of that together, and that makes it really difficult. And there's also, again, often a lack of information sharing between agencies, and it's a time-owed one that, and previously they used to be called serious case reviews, they're now called child practice reviews nationally. And I can guarantee every case will come up around information sharing between agencies, and why haven't we nailed that? And it's really important. We should have nailed that. Agencies should have nailed that with the processes that are in place. So, and where it doesn't take place, where's the challenge? Where's the challenge at a supervisory level and a managerial level? So I think there's all those types of issues which are going on. So you've got all the issues at the operational sort of level. People really trying to do their best, but really struggling with just the sheer amount of work that's coming in through the front door. Often some of which has not been categorised correctly. You've then got your managerial level, and I think there's a lot of issues around, perhaps in some cases around poor supervision. So again, they're not picking up all these issues around the child. What's happened previously in their life, the adverse childhood experiences, and how could that change practice? They're not listening. They're not picking up about what their children are saying, and they're certainly not picking up at a strategic level as well. So you've got partnership. The partnership arena where you've got senior managers getting together, but what's their oversight in respect to some of these cases as well. So I think there's a whole host of things which then cause the problems around dealing with issues such as toxic stress within a child's life, and prevents agencies from effectively dealing with that and taking that forward. So I think that's those are some of the issues, all of which are overcomable at the end of the day. There's some really good practice out there and some real good pockets of practice. And I think, trauma, like I said, previously, trauma-informed practice, where they're looking back and looking about those impacts, building on a child's strengths, working together with families to build up resilience, both within the family, support the family and support the child. So perhaps, even where they are exposed to issues such as adverse childhood experiences and they've got a prevalence to toxic stress, that they can actually be supported, and with a view to obviously coming out of it the other end successfully, really, or as successful as they can. So I think those are all, certainly that's the feedback I get both from operational practitioners and also from the children that I speak to, young people that I speak to. They just want to be heard. They want some consistency as well. That's another big issue for agencies, consistency. So those that are there to support them, so it might be a key social worker, or and often they're changed on a regular basis, again because of operational pressures, and they have to move on to different cases. Well, and again, when you've got a child suffering from toxic stress and all the implications from that, if we're trying to build resilience up in respect to that child, they need that support and that consistent support. And who do they go to if they haven't got a mum or a dad or a guardian? And there's no way of, because of funding, perhaps decent advocacy out there, then to have a social worker changed on a regular basis, or a key health worker or a mental health worker, can be really damaging to that child as well. Yeah, I can think of like I said, some really good pockets of practice. I've seen a real shift in particularly with regards to education, and to give you an example of that, a young female child who was exhibiting particularly sexualized behaviour and also quite violent behaviour, well beyond her years. So this was out of the norm. The school, incredibly, they were used to dealing with that type of behaviour, but for them, and they were actually working in an area where there's social deprivation. So like I said, there were all sorts of issues there which they had to deal with, and they were used to dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. And then that child would come on in and, like I said, exhibit that type of behaviour. We're really good practice when we look at when we talk about good practice. The school put a wraparound around that child, so real one-to-one care. One, because they had to, because the level of violence showed there's a risk to staff, risk to others, but certainly their willingness to support that child, and also the fact that that means putting in specialist resource or resources within the school who have had specialist training. Really good example of that. They put that wraparound around the child, and we know that children find it really difficult to make disclosures if abuse is happening within their family setting or externally, really, if they're being criminally exploited as well. But it was very much getting to the heart of that child and starting to work together with her, and on their terms within reason. which is what happened. They looked at the strengths of the child. So what was her strengths? What were the things that really made that particular child tick? And then they, as a result of which, they built upon those strengths and tried to take her out from the world that she was in and look at the positives in her life. And that was really good. And then they were also working together with the family. And so they were looking at what was happening within the family. They were looking at the family history. They identified numerous adverse childhood experiences going on there, both for this particular child and their siblings. And as a result of which, again, some real positive interaction with mum and dad of this particular girl. To the extent of they, real supportive of mum and dad as well. And often the focus can be on the child, or the focus can be on the parents, and the child gets lost in that journey. But they were able to maintain the focus on both, identifying perhaps some of the key issues and perhaps some of the concerns within that family about who might be abusing that particular child, because she would start to let things out. Some real key practice, again, around therapeutic services and around working with that child to identify some of the key problems that she saw in her life. And at the same time, there was building that child's resilience up, building that child's confidence up to work together with agencies in order to come forward. At the same time, I think there was lots of issues when we talk about resilience with parental resilience, and the fact that perhaps if they've got limited income, they live in areas of deprivation, they lack perhaps the ability to go to resources, have sufficient resources to go to, and perhaps have the knowledge around positive parenting as well. So it's about working together with that, and again, it's that the role of the head teacher and the teachers within the school. Well, they certainly, whilst it might not be their primary role, in order to bring that child through and give them positive outcomes, they work together with the family, and at the same time, in parallel, making those referrals through for the child protection safeguarding process and working together with other agencies. I'm not saying it all went well, but there's just a real positive, example of where people can put the time in and are taking that, get the time pressures and workload taken away from them, and they're afforded the right resource, the right people, and the consistency in a child's life. Then there are some real positive outcomes. That child eventually went forward and made some limited disclosures. Didn't reach the extent of that a prosecution could take place, or criminal justice prosecution, but that's only one outcome, and a lot of it's around safeguarding the child. But certainly their confidence grew, and their trust in other agencies and other people grew, which just means that if they want to make a disclosure, whether it's 2 months down the line, 2 years down the line, or 20 years down the line, at the end of the day, that hopefully they've got a positive experience of working together with professionals. So that's sort of one example where it really went well. And certainly that was feeding when we talk about all the issues I spoke about earlier. Information exchange was pretty good in that case. There was a recognition that there needed to be greater oversight. Somebody had oversight from a managerial supervisory perspective, so they could keep control. Really good evidence of listening to the child on a regular basis, on a daily basis, and listening to what they wanted and working together with them. And as a result of which, hopefully going forward, they won't experience perhaps some of those long-term issues associated with other forms of toxic stress. Well, when you look at toxic stress, you look at the long-term implications, around health, exposure to other forms of exploitation, risk. They're pretty considerable, aren't they? And agencies can't just do it alone, and that's the recognition, really, that at the end of the day, what's really important is that agencies can provide so much of that child's, the pathway for so much of that child's journey. After that, the child at some stage is going to become independent or semi-independent, and the trouble is, if you don't build up that resilience, then that child's likely to become exploited or further abused further down the line, or suffer from all those longer term issues around health, because they're unable to pick themselves and get themselves up and get themselves out of that. And that's why I think it's really important that you get the services right, from an early stage in a child's life, and to work together with them to build their self-resilience, and also the family as well. and that's really important. Too often you'll see, it's very easy, isn't it? And that's been shown nationally with, statistics nationally, where, children are taken out from a family's care because they're deemed to be unable to care for that particular child. But actually, if some additional work could have taken place, again, recognising all the issues that we talked about already around adverse childhood experiences, and some of those parental issues that are out there as well, particularly around mental health, and substance abuse as well. If agencies could work together in order to overcome that, that would assist then, building hopefully a more collegiate family, which the child will feel more comfortable in, and then as a result of which they'll build their resilience up in, the fact they might be able to speak to one, if not both parents, or other, family members from a wider network. And then, like I said, hopefully that child's resilience will grow, and as a result of which, their health, their educational attainment, and I've seen that, there's some really bright children out there that just not given the opportunity because of the abuse and the stress that they've had in their lives, to attain that, and to have those educational outcomes. But provide them with that resilience, you can see, and I've seen that, some real positive outcomes for children who have gone through horrendous circumstances, abuse in their lives and exploitation in their lives, and yet they've come out the other end really successfully, and that's lovely to see, and it just shows that the system can and does work on some cases, but it is a little bit clunky. So I think that, the project, I think, is invaluable in so much as I think, certainly from my perspective, it provided a focus for me and raised my awareness again, provided a bit more interest around this particular aspect. So around, what is the impact of toxic stress on children? So to provide you an example, where certainly within my own review work now, I consider, when I'm talking to frontline operational staff, when I'm talking to managers and supervisors, it's very much around, is that toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences, are they being considered? So I can challenge that, I can challenge practice around that, and look at the systems that are there to protect the children, and what's perhaps failing and what we can learn from that. I think the research is really invaluable, because it's around raising awareness, isn't it? And it raises an awareness. People like me, professionals who work in the safeguarding arena, I think that's incredibly important. Because if we can raise awareness around these types of issues, then hopefully professionals, no matter what their experience are, they'll have a really good ground and a really good understanding of why, like I said right at the very start of this, why a child, might have dysregulated behaviour, and why they might have complex issues, and there might be a better understanding about what their input could be put in respect of that. I think the research is also important because it could probably assist and streamline a lot of the processes that are out there, and if we can understand, I said, that child's journey, as I keep talking about, and that's really, really important, a little bit better through research such as this, then that enhanced professional understanding, and hopefully that will cut through some of the bureaucracy and also makes systems and services a bit more effective and dynamic to actually deal with children. And I think that's really, really important. And I think also as well, it's really important, the research and the project's really important, is perhaps looking at, some of those, fundamental personal factors. So, how do these issues really affect the children? How do they really affect the families? Probably more longer term than is probably being currently looked at this moment in time. And we know, don't we? That's every stage of the child's development, from birth all the way up through to adolescence, and like I said, moving on to adulthood as well. And I think it'll highlight some of those key issues and some of the key interventions that all agencies should be putting in respect to children. So yeah. So I think it's a real positive move, and I certainly welcome any of this type of research. Certainly, again, this is not from me. It's in so much as it's something that I've gained through some of the review work and speaking to victims and survivors of abuse. And children who are able, from an age-specific perspective, when they talk to me, an age-appropriate perspective, when I'm able to talk to them, shall I say, language, what comes out clear is language is really, really important in developing, confidence in all in systems approaches, so the agency's approaches to that particular child's case, and also in personal interactions as well with, specialists and professionals that work together with children. And so often, professionals might use language which is inappropriate, and the child, as a result of which, the child takes away some small snippets that come from that information, and in their own mind they perhaps believe that the professional doesn't believe them. So they might make, so for instance, they might make partial disclosures around abuse that might be occurring within their own family setting, or perhaps wider around, like I said, greater exploitation, and as a result of which the interaction is very much together with the adult. It comes across as perhaps the adults don't believe them, the professionals don't believe them and what they're saying. They question them inappropriately, they use victim blaming language, and as a result of which, and another case only recently where, certainly one of the managers on reviewing the case turned around to me and said, no wonder this child would never engage, with professionals going forward in their life. And this particular child was going missing on numerous occasions. And the result was that she would never engage following those missing episodes with any professional because of one or two individuals right at the start of a journey who had misused language or used it inappropriately. So children have to trust you, and it's really important if you want to get them to disclose. Like I said, they have to be able to trust you, and so the language you use throughout a child's case and to families as well has got to be appropriate and got to be appropriate to the circumstance, and it certainly shouldn't be victim blaming. And that's really, really important. Otherwise, you'll never progress that case and you'll never build the resilience that we've been talking about during this interview.